What price would you be willing to pay for a safer society? Would you be willing to risk the chance of innocent lives in order to get a safer society? What I'm referring to here is the death penalty. The death penalty is the blind spot of justice where the worst aspects of the criminal legal system make themselves apparent. And to prove this, I am going to discuss the prejudices associated with the death penalty, as well as whether such a punishment is even effective. Following this, yours truly is going to take a closer look at the problems and what is causing them, which will lead us right to the possible alternatives we could take right now. Now, to start us off, I want to first discuss what the death penalty even is. The death penalty is meant to be the harshest punishment reserved for the worst of the worst, wherein, after the accused it goes through legal court cases to decide whether they face execution or not, they either get off death row and are free to go, or not free to go as they go to prison, as it's to say in prison, or face their death. But by examining the so-called worst of the worst that even go through the death row and the death penalty process, comes the first problem, as according to a source from CNN, published on March 21st, 2021, comes information about how the death penalty disproportionately kills blacks and Latinos, with many of these people later being found to have been wrongfully convicted. By connecting the dots of what this information is saying, it essentially says that racial bias is a huge factor into the death penalty, as many blacks and Latinos are being disproportionately represented on the death row and actually receiving the death penalty. But wait, there's more. As from a source from the source of Scientific American, published March 19, 2024, comes information on how there is a lack of credible evidence that points toward the death penalty deterring crime, with at least 20 known innocent people having already been executed. The loss of a single innocent life to a punishment is a tragedy, but the loss of 20 innocent lives to a punishment that doesn't even deter crime, well, it really says all it needs to, doesn't it? This isn't justice, this is murder. But a counterargument that might be coming out here is that, am I perhaps looking too far into the racial biases that I mentioned earlier? Is it perhaps possible that such disproportionate amounts of blacks and Latinos is just a coincidence, like not intentional? Well, to that, I only have one word, and that is objection. As, according to information here from Time Magazine, from as recent as September 27th, 2024, comes information that violent crimes where the perpetrator was black and the victim was white are much more likely to land the accused on death row. What this means is that racial bias does indeed is a factor into the death penalty. Not only that, but a racism is seemingly here getting in the way of true justice, as the wrong people are being accused for crimes they didn't commit, while the actual people are scot-free. But to continue on with this comes information from the Sacramento Bee, published November 8, 2024, that discusses how the death penalty is not only lengthy, but it's also more expensive than life in prison without parole due to the court costs of those lengthy cases. But on top of that, the life in prison without parole decapacitates criminals just the same as the death penalty does. What this all means is that the death penalty is not only more expensive than the life in prison without parole, and more lengthy, but it also has much more risks in it, as was previously discussed with all the innocent people getting murdered by it. So that begs a question: if it has the same results as life in prison without parole, then why not carry that out instead? And that indeed is it's a good question. Why not? And that takes us to our solutions. As an article from Gallup, published November 25th, 2019, discusses how a 2019 survey found that 60% of Americans prefer life in prison without possibility for parole over the death penalty. And as I was discussing earlier, as an American, life in prison without parole over the death penalty just makes much more sense. There's much less risk involved. For example, take if we get someone that was wrongly accused for a crime, we end up giving them life in prison without parole. And say like 2 years later, we find the actual person that committed the crime, meaning the person we put in life in prison without parole was innocent. Well, we can always set them free and offer them monetary compensation, as life in prison without parole is more reversible than say the death penalty. It's a death penalty. You end up getting executed. There's no coming back from death. You're dead right there. the closest thing you could do is give monetary compensation to the families, but the actual person who faced death, they don't get anything. At least with life in prison without parole, while we can't give someone the time back, we can at least offer them something, that be monetary compensation and money, as in money. But with life in prison without parole, or just life in prison, there could also come a second solution, that being restorative justice. As talked about by an article from the Marshall Project published September 16, 2023, is the opportunity that restorative justice can have. But restorative justice involves three parties, that being the community, the perpetrator of the crime, and the victim of the crime. Through restorative justice, the three parties talk to each other and try to make things right. Through the process, the perpetrator of the crime ends up taking accountability for the crime and ends up being rehabilitated, with the victim with the victim of the crime also trying to have all their needs met. As the article mentions, and this is a direct quote here, prosecutors who are working on this sort of approach have also frequently told me that the process is more transformative for victims of crime than it is for perpetrators of crime. When this quote is taken into context with the rest of the article, it means that all three parties end up having better outcomes than what typically occurs with life in prison without parole or the death penalty. As after all, the victims end up coming out of this much better, and we also end up getting the perpetrators of the crime rehabilitated as they take accountability. So if we have a solution here, that being restorative justice, when all three parties end up better in the end, following that end up better with that solution, than say something like life in prison or the death penalty. Why not go through with this more often rather than death penalty? As restorative justice as it is, isn't that common? So this takes us to the end here, as I hope one thing has been made clear to what I've had to say, that being that by escaping the barbaric ways of the death penalty, we can better strive towards justice. So, back to my question at the beginning, is it worth having a punishment such as the death penalty that gives us the illusion of freedom if such a punishment does more harm? I find the answer to have been made clear, crystal clear,